Not every great thinker made it into the philosophy textbooks. Some were silenced, others were erased over time, not because they lacked genius, but because they dared to think differently. They challenged religions, empires, governments, and even the philosophical system itself. They put ideas above safety, above official morality, and sometimes above their own lives. Their works were burned, banned, forgotten, not by accident, but for the convenience of those in power, because their questions were uncomfortable, because their answers were dangerous. This video is not about the philosophers you already know. It's about those who were pushed out of memory, the subversives of thought, the ones who paid the price for thinking too much, the ones history tried to bury. Welcome to the philosophy of the forgotten. Imagine a man walking through the markets and squares of Athens, questioning everyone and everything, from soldiers to priests, from craftsmen to politicians. He wasn't selling anything, didn't write any books, and yet his name would cross the centuries. Socrates was that man, a thinker who lived in a time when thinking too much could cost you dearly. And it did. It cost him his life. Athens, 5th century BCE, a city at the height of its cultural power, but also in deep crisis. The Peloponnesian War had left open wounds, and Athenian pride was starting to crack. What was once seen as the glory of democracy and freedom was turning into a society more and more suspicious, religious, and intolerant of internal criticism. In this unstable environment, Socrates emerged as a challenger of tradition, not with swords, but with questions. Socrates never wrote a single line. Everything we know about him comes from his students, like Plato and Xenophon, but his actions and words echoed so strongly that his philosophical presence became almost inescapable. His mission was simple and at the same time radical: make people think for themselves, not accept ready-made beliefs, ancient myths, or the truths of priests without first putting them to the test of reason. In a time when the gods explained everything, Socrates asked, what is justice? What is good? What is virtue? And he didn't accept vague answers. When someone said, justice is obeying the laws, he would reply, and if the laws are unjust? This kind of questioning shook the foundations of the city. Because Athens wasn't just a democracy, it was a theological political polis, where laws, gods, and tradition were deeply intertwined. Socrates was formally charged with 2 crimes: corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. But behind those accusations, there was something deeper. Socrates represented the collapse of the old order. He challenged Athens' founding myths. He mocked the idea that wisdom came from birth or social class. He dared to say that ignorance disguised as certainty was more dangerous than honest doubt. One of his most famous lines appears in the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato. The unexamined life is not worth living. That sentence wasn't just a philosophical reflection. It was a direct attack on the superficial way many people lived, accepting customs and beliefs without any critical thought. Socrates didn't just talk, he lived his philosophy. He walked barefoot, refused money, and debated with anyone willing to talk. He did this right in the public square, the agora, where young people gathered around him, fascinated by his sharp mind and provocative paradoxes. These young people started to doubt the speeches of politicians and priests. They began to think. And that, for the Athenian elite, was a real threat. Among those who listened to him were figures like Alcibiades and Critias, 2 controversial men who later got involved with authoritarian regimes. Socrates was blamed by association for the political acts of his former students, even though he had never encouraged them. But in a time of fear and distrust, philosophy started to be confused with subversion. The charge of impiety was serious as well. Socrates didn't deny the existence of the gods, but he did question the traditional ones. He said he listened to a daimonion, a kind of inner voice, almost like a moral conscience. That shocked religious people. Instead of following public rituals, he trusted an inner guidance. It was as if he were saying that truth didn't come from the temple, but from the soul. In practice, Socrates was persecuted for thinking too authentically, for challenging the fusion of religion, politics, and the moral order of his time. He was put on trial by a popular assembly, the very democracy we admire so much, and condemned to death. Socrates could have escaped. His students tried to help him flee, but he refused. He said staying true to his principles was more important than his own life. In his final moments, according to Plato, he drank the hemlock calmly. He talked about the immortality of the soul, and even joked with his friends. He died as he lived, searching for truth, faithful to his conscience, challenging the intellectual mediocrity of his time. Socrates is often remembered as the father of Western philosophy, but he is also a symbol of something bigger, the cost of integrity in a world that fears free thinking. He represents the eternal conflict between critical clarity and social dogma, between the desire to know and the fear of doubt. How many people today would be judged the same way if they dared to ask too many questions? How many times does the system try to silence those who think differently, even if it no longer uses poison, but irony, ridicule, or exclusion? The story of Socrates is a living lesson. Philosophy is uncomfortable. It tears apart certainties, exposes contradictions, and demands courage. That's why so many have tried to silence it throughout history. But that's also why it never dies. It just changes its face, its square, its time. By understanding why Socrates was killed, we also understand why thinking is an act of courage. And you? Have you ever asked yourself what you believe, and why? The silence that fell over the synagogue that day was absolute. The doors were locked. No one in the Jewish community of Amsterdam dared to challenge the decision. A young man, son of Portuguese merchants, raised in the scriptures and in tradition, was banished with words that burned more than fire. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he comes in, and cursed be he when he goes out. This was the herem, the harshest excommunication order in Judaism, and the name of the young man being cursed was Baruch Spinoza. But why would a philosopher be silenced so radically? What did he say that could threaten an entire community so much that they denied him not only a voice, but also his name, his presence, his touch, even his funeral? Spinoza committed a sin that went far beyond the walls of the synagogue. He thought for himself. He questioned the human-shaped image of God, rejected miracles as violations of the laws of nature, and, even worse, wrote that God is nature. God is not above the world or outside it. God is the world in its rational, infinite, necessary order. This view, admired today by many as a refined form of philosophical spirituality, was at the time completely unacceptable. Spinoza's God doesn't listen to prayers, doesn't make covenants, doesn't punish, and doesn't save. He has no face, no human will. He is everything that exists, and everything that exists is God. This doctrine, called pantheism, was a scandal not only for Jews, but also for Christians. It undermined the foundations of revelation, religious authority, and a morality based on fear of hell and hope for heaven. For Spinoza, morality shouldn't come from fear, but from understanding, from love of reason, not blind obedience to commandments. In his masterpiece, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, Spinoza lays out his view of the world clearly. Inspired by Euclid, he presents philosophy as a logical system where everything unfolds as a consequence of the divine substance, unique, eternal, infinite. The very first proposition already makes his starting point clear. God is the immanent cause of all things, not a transient cause. In other words, God doesn't create the world from the outside, like a potter shaping clay. God is the very substance of the world, its foundation and its expression. And as such, there is no absolute good or evil, only ways of existing, more or less adequate ways of living according to reason. This philosophy puts the human being at the center of a rational universe, not as a servant of an arbitrary God, but as an active part of a nature that can be understood. For Spinoza, freedom is not doing whatever you want, but understanding why you want what you want. Freedom is clarity, not whim. This breaks with centuries of theology. There is no room for miracles, original sin, or a final judgment. Everything that happens out of necessity, according to the eternal laws of nature. This doesn't make life cold or mechanical. On the contrary, for Spinoza, understanding this order is to experience what he calls the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis, the highest joy of the soul. But Spinoza's boldness didn't stop at metaphysics. In his theological political treatise, he defends even more provocative ideas: the separation between faith and reason, between religion and the state. He writes that the biblical prophets were not philosophers, and that the Bible should be read as a historical document, subject to context and criticism. Unlike religious dogmas, Spinoza believed faith should serve justice and love of one's neighbor, not repression. And the state, for him, is only legitimate when it guarantees freedom of thought. The end of the state is freedom. These ideas made him persona non grata for institutional Christianity as well. His books were placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books. Protestant leaders accused him of atheism. And yet, ironically, Spinoza never called himself an atheist. He saw God in all things, but a God who doesn't speak, doesn't choose, and doesn't punish. A God that is simply reality in its totality. After being expelled from his community, Spinoza didn't go looking for another one. He didn't found a school, didn't try to gather followers. He made a living polishing lenses, manual work that also reflects his philosophy, helping others see more clearly. He turned down academic positions that would have forced him to soften his ideas. He lived simply, almost alone, but with deep coherence. He never chased fame or power, and even so, or maybe exactly because of that, he became one of the pillars of modern philosophy. Centuries later, figures like Goethe, Hegel, Nietzsche, Einstein, and Deleuze would praise him as a master. Einstein, for example, said he believed in Spinoza's God, the one who reveals himself in the harmony of the universe, not in holy books. Nietzsche called him a precursor, someone who dared to think beyond good and evil. But in his own time, Spinoza was rejected from all sides. For religious people, he was a heretic. For Cartesians, he was too radical. For politicians, dangerous. For many, simply incomprehensible. And yet he stayed loyal to his vision. He never took back his ideas. He never apologized. He died young, at 44, from tuberculosis, worsened by the dust from the lenses he polished. Spinoza teaches us that there is courage in thinking things through to the end, even if it costs you everything. That philosophy is not a luxury, but a way of living with integrity. That there is greatness in seeing the world as a rational order, not cold, but infinitely beautiful. And that there is a deeper freedom than the freedom to act, the freedom to understand. Today, when so many religions still fight over dogmas and exclusive truths, Spinoza's voice echoes as a calm and radical alternative. What if God is everything? What if the sacred isn't above the world, but in every part of it? He didn't write books. He didn't found schools. He didn't look for followers or recognition. Instead, he lived in a barrel, ate whatever he could find, slept wherever the sun allowed, and urinated in public. His name was Diogenes of Sinope, and his philosophy was a walking insult to everything his society considered sacred: wealth, status, power, convention. In 4th century BC Athens, where Plato's speeches captivated the elites and citizens fought for public honors, Diogenes did the exact opposite. He ripped off the polished surface of civilization with brutally honest acts. Not out of disrespect, but out of principle. Real life is only possible when you're free from illusions. Diogenes is the father of the Cynic school, from the Greek kynikos, which means dog-like. And that's no coincidence. He compared himself to a dog, a creature that barks at fakes, bites hypocrites, lives with the bare minimum and bows to no one. Diogenes lived like an animal, not out of degradation, but by choice. To him, society was sick. The cure? Strip away everything that's unnecessary. Most people live to please others, he said. They hide their desires, wear social masks, and pile up possessions just to impress. Diogenes refused that. He looked for self-sufficiency, autarkia, living with so little that nothing could be taken from him. No king, no priest, no merchant could have power over him, because he needed nothing from them. They say that when he saw a boy drinking water with his hands, Diogenes threw away his bowl and said, "That boy just beat me. I don't even need this." That was his ethic. Every object, every comfort was a chain of dependence, and dependence for him was the root of all modern slavery. But Diogenes wasn't just a hermit. He was a philosophical provocateur. He turned his life into a kind of theatre of resistance, an inverted mirror of hypocrisy. When he saw Athenians raising statues to heroes, he mocked them. You put up statues for those who killed thousands, but ignore those who live with virtue. He once walked through the marketplace with a lit lantern in broad daylight, saying, "I'm looking for an honest man." And when someone asked why he lived in such misery, he answered, "You live miserably because you're afraid of living like I do." Diogenes' radical stance bothered people so much that he was chased off, insulted, and laughed at. But he not only accepted that, he turned it into his strength. Shame, to him, was a tool created by those who wanted to tame others. Diogenes broke every basic moral code of his time. He ate in the streets, masturbated in public, and urinated on the rich. With every act, he was silently asking, "I'm free. Are you?" Political power, especially, was one of his favorite targets. Diogenes didn't believe in titles, thrones, medals, or glory. For him, a king was just another man with more desires than courage. That's why one of the most famous scenes in Greek philosophy is the encounter between Diogenes and Alexander the Great. The conqueror of the known world wanted to meet the most infamous beggar in Athens. When Alexander found him lying in the sun, he said, "I am Alexander the Great." Diogenes replied, "And I am Diogenes the dog." Alexander then offered to give him anything he wanted, and Diogenes simply said, "Step aside a little. You're blocking my sun." That answer went down in history as a symbol of inner freedom. Alexander conquered kingdoms, but Diogenes didn't need to conquer anything to be untouchable. He had what almost nobody has: total independence from society's value system. So, what exactly was he criticizing? Diogenes saw social conventions as a collective illusion. The dominant morality was, in his eyes, nothing more than an artificial code created to serve the interests of power. Nobility, property, marriage, homeland, all of that for him were fictions. That's why his philosophy was lived in the body, in gestures, in scandal. He didn't write, he embodied his critique. By making fun of customs, Diogenes wanted to trigger an ethical awakening. He wanted people to understand that happiness doesn't come from social approval, but from inner freedom. Freedom isn't inherited, it's won by letting go. That was his unspoken motto, and that freedom, according to him, could only be reached if a person freed themselves from the need to please, consume, and possess. That's the core of classical cynicism, very different from the modern idea of cynical as someone fake or bitter. For Diogenes, the cynic was the truthful one, the person who lives according to nature, not according to a twisted culture. But living against everything and everyone comes with a price. Diogenes was pushed to the margins. He became a figure of mockery and scandal. People saw him as a madman, and yet some of the greatest thinkers admired him deeply. Stoics like Epictetus and Seneca considered him a model of virtue. Centuries later, Nietzsche would point to him as a kind of early overman, someone who creates his own values. Society, however, has always preferred the Alexanders, the ones who rule, shine, and win. Very few are willing to follow Diogenes' path because it demands total rupture. But his lesson is still alive, especially in an age of excess. In a world obsessed with appearances, status, and consumption, the old dog of Athens still asks us, "Are you free? Or did you just get used to the collar? What's most striking about Diogenes isn't his irreverence, it's his consistency. He didn't call out hypocrisy with empty words. He lived as if it were possible to exist outside the system. He was a moral exile, a wandering philosopher, a rebel without a stage. And that's why he was ridiculed and forgotten for so long. His philosophy didn't fit in academies, temples, or royal courts. He didn't offer formulas or comfort. He only offered a mirror, a harsh mirror, but a necessary one. And in that mirror, we're left with the question he never wrote down, but lived every day. How many of your needs are really yours, and how many were planted there by others? A man once dreamed he was a butterfly. He flew from flower to flower, light and free, with no idea he was Zhuangzi. When he woke up, he asked himself, am I Zhuangzi who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that I am Zhuangzi? This isn't just a poetic image. It's the core of a philosophy that challenges the line between reality and illusion, between form and essence, between what is imposed and what is spontaneous. Zhuangzi, or Chuang-Tzu, lived in China during the Warring States period, around the 4th century BC, a turbulent era marked by constant wars and political projects of centralization. In that context, one way of thinking started to stand out as the solution to chaos: Confucianism, with its focus on order, hierarchy, discipline, and ritual. Zhuangzi walked in the opposite direction. For him, all that rigidity was a sickness. A civilization built on artificial rules was doomed to suffocate life. His book, The Zhuangzi, is not a systematic treatise. It's a collection of stories, parables, fables, provocations, and irony. Its style is already an act of rebellion. It doesn't impose truths, it invites doubt. And that fragmentary form fits perfectly with its message, a defense of a fluid, free, natural way of living. While the Confucians wanted to shape obedient, virtuous citizens molded by centuries of tradition, Zhuangzi saw that as cutting off the soul. He mocked rituals, etiquette, and the obsession with being proper. One of his most famous stories is about a cook who, when cutting up an ox, doesn't fight the meat. He simply follows the natural spaces between the bones. Perfection lies in not forcing anything, said the master. That was his philosophy in a nutshell. Living according to the Tao, the way, isn't about following strict rules, but moving with reality and its constant changes. The Tao, for Zhuangzi, can't be named, controlled, or fully grasped through rigid concepts. Unlike the Confucians, who believed moral codes and social order led to the good, the Taoists saw those constructions as dangerous interference. When the state decides what is right, it also decides what is wrong, and traps the human spirit between artificial extremes. For Zhuangzi, absolute moral categories are a product of ignorance. What's considered beautiful in one place might seem grotesque in another. What's useful for one person might be useless for another. Who can really say what the truth is? This radical relativization isn't nihilism. It's a deep kind of wisdom. Life is too vast to be reduced to formulas. Every being has its own path. Trying to standardize them is a way of destroying their essence. That's why Zhuangzi rejects political power, social duty, fame, and progress. In a famous passage, he's invited to take a position in government and answers, "I've heard there's a sacred turtle in your temple. It's dead, but its shell is honored. Tell me, would that turtle rather be dead and honored, or alive, dragging its tail through the mud?" Zhuangzi chose the mud, real life, imperfect but authentic, instead of the cold glory of serving the state. This spirit was deeply subversive. In a time when imperial stability demanded uniformity, discipline, and obedience, Zhuangzi was promoting spontaneity, letting go, and creative disorder. The Confucian state saw Taoism as a threat because Taoism rejected the very idea of rigid structure. It wasn't against one specific system, it was against all systems. Over the centuries, Zhuangzi's philosophy was pushed aside, censored, or rebranded. During the more authoritarian imperial periods, like under the Han dynasty, Confucianism was declared the official doctrine. Taoism was tolerated only as a mystical religion, not as a political or existential philosophy. And in truth, Zhuangzi wasn't a politician. He was an existential anarchist. He didn't preach external revolutions, but an inner one, letting go of certainties, loosening the ego, dissolving the hard border between me and the world. For him, what really imprisons human beings isn't outer chains, but the conditioned mind. The perfect person has no self. The wise person has no claim to merit. The sage has no concern for fame. That's the trio of detachment he offers, an invitation to lightness. The modern world, obsessed with productivity, control, and identity, might be the exact opposite of Zhuangzi's philosophy. In a time where everything is measured, compared, and categorized, the Chinese thinker reminds us, the best things in life don't fit into metrics. Unexpected laughter, quiet contemplation, a spontaneous gesture, a strange dream that feels real. All of that is the Tao in motion. But to notice the Tao, you have to quiet the external noise. Zhuangzi teaches that it's not reality that's oppressive, but a mind trained by convention. Who defines what success is? Who decides what's worthy? He turns those questions back on us and leaves us suspended, like the butterfly in the dream. Unlike so many other philosophers who fought to be remembered by history, Zhuangzi wasn't trying to build a legacy. He didn't found a school, didn't organize formal disciples, didn't create dogmas. His own text is ambiguous, full of layers and symbolic stories. It's as if he already knew that every attempt to freeze truth is also the first step toward distorting it. His refusal to be domesticated makes him, ironically, permanently current. Whenever institutions try to normalize, standardize, and moralize everything, Zhuangzi shows up as a voice of deviation, lightness, and necessary doubt. And maybe that's why he was silenced, not through open violence, but through marginalization. His name rarely appeared among the great official masters. His philosophy was labeled impractical, useless, not compatible with the common good. But what is the common good if it erases each person's uniqueness? Zhuangzi wanted something deeper, the freedom to simply be, without needing to justify, belong, prove, or obey. And that kind of freedom still bothers people today. Zhuangzi wasn't forgotten by accident. He was forgotten because his philosophy doesn't serve any project of power. It doesn't build empires, doesn't preserve traditions, doesn't create systems. It frees. And freedom, in its most radical form, is always disliked by those who control. Between swords and speeches, between the toga and the political arena, there was a man who tried to use words as a shield against tyranny. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero, lawyer, politician, and philosopher, and above all, a republican to the very end. At a time when Rome was shifting from a republic to an empire, Cicero was a discordant voice. While others bowed to the rise of strongmen like Caesar and later Augustus, he still believed that power should be shared, guided by reason, and sustained by just laws and the common good, not by personal ambition. But history didn't treat him fairly. In the Middle Ages, his philosophy was largely forgotten, overshadowed, and replaced by another moral order, the Christian one. His political ideas, inspired by Stoicism and a love of civic freedom, didn't fit well in an era of absolute monarchies and church dogma. Cicero's name survived, but his core ideas were swallowed by silence. He lived in the 1st century BC, one of the most unstable periods in Roman history. Conspiracies, dictators, civil wars. The Republic was dying, and Cicero saw it with painful clarity. His project was clear: restore the authority of laws, reason, and civic virtue. But in practice, he watched the collapse of what he loved most. Cicero was not a cloistered philosopher. He didn't hide in schools or gardens. He wrote philosophy in the middle of trials and conspiracies, while governing provinces, negotiating with senators, and confronting tyrants. His philosophy was practical, applied, and political to the core. And that may be one of the reasons his work was suppressed for so long. It makes people who fear freedom uncomfortable. His great political work, De Re Publica, on the Republic, is a passionate defense of a mixed government based on balance between institutions, customs, and moral responsibility. Cicero dreamed of a Rome guided by reason and ius, the rule of law, not the whims of emperors. Inspired by Plato, but more pragmatic, he wrote not for an ideal world, but for a real Rome, corrupted by ambition. And he was very direct when he said, "The salvation of the Republic lies in the virtue of its citizens." This ethical political idealism, deeply tied to Roman Stoicism, claimed that the truly virtuous citizen is not the one who seeks his own good, but the common good. Virtues is not contemplation, it is action. For Cicero, it's not enough to be good in private. Real ethics is proven in public life. But this view clashed with the new religious order that would solidify centuries later. Christianity, especially after becoming the official religion of the empire, shifted the center of morality. From the virtuous citizen focused on the polis, we moved to the obedient believer focused on the afterlife. Action was replaced by faith, politics by dogma, justice by salvation. And Cicero, who believed the soul is perfected through the practice of citizenship, was quietly pushed aside. During the Middle Ages, his philosophical work was mostly ignored, while his rhetorical texts were partly preserved as models of style. The content was diluted. His political voice was muffled. He stopped being read by statesmen and became reading material for grammarians. What was lost in that forgetting? We lost a philosophy that united ethics and politics as inseparable parts of human life. We lost the idea that freedom is not a divine gift, but a fragile collective construction that demands courage and constant vigilance. Cicero was not just a defender of law, he was a critic of unchecked power. He believed that any system that concentrated too much authority in one person was a direct path to tyranny. And he knew what he was talking about. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Cicero opposed him. When the Senate lost its authority, he mourned it. When Roman customs were replaced by the cult of personality, he wrote, "The rule of men is fragile, the rule of reason is eternal." Cicero paid a high price for his loyalty to the Republic. After Caesar's assassination, he tried to restore the Republican order with his famous speeches against Mark Antony, known as the Philippics. But he was declared an enemy of the state. His head was cut off and displayed in the Roman Forum. A tragic end for a man who dreamed of justice. But his philosophy didn't die there. It stayed dormant in the shadows of history until it was rediscovered during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Machiavelli, Locke, Montesquieu, and the founders of the American Revolution would find in Cicero a model of political philosophy grounded in reason, legality, and human dignity. Thomas Jefferson, for example, said Cicero was one of the pillars of his political education. Montesquieu saw him as a bridge between Greek wisdom and the Roman spirit, and Voltaire called him the greatest philosopher who ever wrote in Latin. Even so, this late revival shows that Cicero was ahead of his time, and that's why he was left behind. His ideas demanded active citizenship, a moral commitment to the public good, and constant watchfulness against authoritarianism. And the medieval world, built on religious authority, had no room for that kind of public philosophy. His ethics were stoic, but adapted to everyday life. He didn't preach withdrawal, but engagement. For him, virtue wasn't an escape from the world, but full presence in it. He wrote, "Philosophy was not made for the salons, but for the Senate." Today, in a time of democratic crisis, manipulated public discourse, and weakened institutions, Cicero's forgotten voice feels strangely timely. He reminds us that freedom is not eternal, that the rule of law doesn't sustain itself, and that politics requires character, not just technical skill. Maybe that's exactly why his philosophy was silenced, because it demands responsibility, moral courage, and resistance to unjust power. It exposes cynicism disguised as pragmatism, blind obedience disguised as faith, and passivity disguised as humility. Cicero was not only a martyr of Roman politics, he was a martyr of a kind of philosophy that demands ethical action in the real world, something that is rarely welcome in systems that prefer subjects over citizens. But his legacy, even after centuries of neglect, survives as a call to action. A reminder that to think philosophically is not just to reflect, it is to act, to choose, to take part in the fate of the community. At the heart of the Chinese Confucian tradition, where knowledge was built on books, commentaries, and rituals, one man dared to say that truth is not in the texts, but in the human heart. His name was Wang Yangming, and his philosophy was like a spark thrown into a barn full of scrolls, simple, direct, and deeply incendiary. Born in 1472, during the Ming dynasty, Wang Yangming was everything a respectable man of his time was supposed to be: a scholar, a military officer, a state official. He went through the brutal imperial exams, mastered the Confucian classics, and climbed the ladder of the rigid Chinese hierarchy. And yet, at the height of his public career, he went through such a radical inner shift that his thinking started to turn against the very system that had formed him. To understand the philosophical revolution Wang Yangming sparked, you first need to understand what the traditional Confucian system was, especially its educational side. Since the Han Dynasty, Confucianism had been the official ideology of the state. Political order was built on moral hierarchy, obedience to ritual, respect for superiors, and memorization of the classics. The path to social advancement was mastering ancient texts and repeating them in the imperial exams that selected the empire's bureaucrats. Knowledge was external, text-based, and rule-driven. In that context, Wang Yangming dared to say the opposite. The mind is the principle. In other words, the source of morality is not in books or rules, but in the human mind. More specifically, in its inborn moral intuition. This doctrine became known as the unity of knowledge and action, and it turned the empire's entire educational model upside down. For Wang, there's no point in studying virtue if you don't live virtuously. To truly know the good is to act according to the good. If you know what is right but don't do it, then you don't really know. His philosophy came close to Stoicism, in the sense that it called the individual to inner coherence, responsibility for their own conscience, and moral autonomy. But inside the Confucian tradition, this was way too radical, because it opened up a dangerous possibility. If the individual mind can judge what is right on its own, then the state loses its monopoly over morality. The idea that anyone, even without titles or classical training, could understand the Tao, the way, through their own intuition, directly threatened the authority of the educated elite. It was like saying that a peasant or a common soldier could reach moral wisdom without passing the exams, without memorizing the analects, without bowing to formal tradition. And more than that, by saying that the human mind is one with the universal principle, Lai, Wang Yangming brought heaven and the heart closer together, Tianli, heavenly principle, and conscience. For him, there is no real separation between the cosmos and inner life. Every person carries within themselves the light of heaven. But he didn't always think this way. His transformation was slow, deep, and marked by suffering. At one point in his life, he was sent into exile for criticizing corrupt officials. There, far from the political center and stripped of his duties, he began reflecting on the nature of knowledge. One quiet night, he experienced a kind of spiritual breakthrough. He realized that books were not enough, that truth is not acquired, but revealed through experience and an awakened conscience. From that moment on, his philosophy also became a project of inner resistance. Instead of blindly obeying tradition, he proposed cultivating the mind as an act of freedom. Study stopped being mere repetition and became a process of self-knowledge that transforms. Wang Yangming began to teach this publicly. He attracted disciples, angered conservatives, and became an object of suspicion for the state. His school of thought was at first tolerated because of his reputation as a competent general and official. But after his death, his followers were persecuted and his ideas banned at various times. Because deep down, what he was proposing was far too democratic for an authoritarian system. There was no longer a small elite that owned moral truth. Each individual was now responsible for their own ethical judgment. Education stopped being a tool for standardization and became a process of inner awakening. That doesn't mean Wang Yangming was a libertarian in the modern sense. He still valued Confucianism, ritual and social order, but he believed virtue doesn't come from form, it comes from spirit. Etiquette without conscience is vanity. Ritual without intention is empty. His doctrine, though it belonged to the Confucian world, carried seeds of existential rebellion. It was like a quiet revolt, not against the emperor, but against the idea that external authority can replace inner conscience. And that's what made him such an ambiguous figure over the centuries. In stable times, his writings were read and even praised, but always carefully. In times of crisis, they were suppressed. During the Qing dynasty, for example, his philosophy was practically banned as a threat to orthodoxy, and even so, it survived. In small circles, in minor schools, on the margins of official culture. In Japan, his ideas influenced samurai schools and strands of Bushido. In the 20th century, Chinese intellectuals rediscovered him as a symbol of authentic ethics in contrast to rigid state Confucianism. His philosophy also echoes modern thinkers. There is something of Rousseau in him, the natural goodness of the human being, something of Kant, moral autonomy, and even something of Kierkegaard, truth as lived experience. But maybe the most striking thing about Wang Yangming is that, within an ancient tradition, he anticipates a philosophy of ethical freedom that feels incredibly current. In a world where so many people wait for orders, validation, and external approval, he reminds us, the whole world may be mistaken, but if your mind is clear, there is no doubt in your heart. Today, in an age of mass education, shallow public morality, and states that want citizens who obey more than citizens who think, Wang Yangming's forgotten voice sounds like a quiet act of courage. Conscience is the first teacher, not the diploma, not the manual, not the job title. Wang Yangming wasn't silenced by brute force. He was silenced by the institutionalization of knowledge, by a system that fears individuals who think for themselves. His philosophy is not a noisy revolt. It's a calm invitation to moral clarity. And maybe that's exactly why it still scares people. At the end of the Middle Ages, when theology and philosophy walked almost hand in hand under the watchful eyes of the Church, one man dared to draw a line between faith and reason, and not to reconcile them, but to expose their tension in the rawest way. Pietro Pomponazzi, born in 1462, was an Italian philosopher who lived in a time when thinking too much about certain topics wasn't just dangerous, it was almost an invitation to be condemned. A professor at the prestigious University of Padua and later in Bologna, he dove deep into the writings of Aristotle, not like a submissive scholastic, but like a restless mind. And by doing that, he dug up an explosive idea. Philosophy, when taken seriously, does not prove the immortality of the soul. That statement alone was enough to put him under suspicion. Because for Christianity, and for the state shaped by it, the immortality of the soul wasn't just a spiritual belief. It was the foundation of morality, salvation, punishment, and social control. To deny it, even philosophically, meant touching the very structure that supported religious and political authority. But Pomponazzi didn't attack faith. He didn't present himself as a heretic, atheist, or provocateur. On the contrary, he was a meticulous scholar, loyal to the Aristotelian intellectual tradition, and yet, he insisted that human reason, by itself, could not prove that the soul survives the death of the body. His most controversial work, published in 1516, was Tractatus de Immortalitate Animae, Treatise on the Immortality of the Soul. The impact was immediate. He begins by saying, in a methodical way, that he will analyze the problem based on natural philosophy, meaning putting faith aside and relying only on logic, experience, and classical texts. And what does he conclude? That according to Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body, and therefore cannot exist without it. There is nothing in Aristotelian thought that proves an immaterial and eternal soul the way Christian theology claims. If we are honest with philosophical arguments, we must admit that the soul is mortal. This sentence, simple at first glance, was a bomb. Because Pomponazzi wasn't just doubting, he was exposing that faith leaned on philosophy for support. But when philosophy stood on its own, it did not confirm the dogmas. That's when he introduced a crucial but risky distinction: the separation between what is true according to reason and what is true according to faith. He himself said, "As a philosopher, I am compelled to conclude that the soul is mortal. As a Christian, I believe it is immortal." This attempt to balance between two worlds, the world of reason and the world of belief, didn't really convince either side. For theologians, it was scandalous. For skeptics, it was cowardice. But for the history of philosophy, it was a crucial step toward modernity. Pomponazzi was one of the first to clearly say that philosophy should not serve faith, but follow its own path, even if that path leads to uncomfortable conclusions. It's important to understand, he wasn't trying to destroy religion. He was trying to protect the intellectual honesty of philosophy. For Pomponazzi, truth cannot be forced to bow to religious authority. If reason leads to a conclusion, that conclusion must be respected, even if it conflicts with doctrine. For the 16th century, though, this was basically heresy disguised as scholarship. The reaction was quick. His work was condemned by the Inquisition, his books were publicly burned in Venice, and he began living under constant surveillance. Only his academic reputation and political caution kept him from a worse fate. Pomponazzi tried to defend himself by saying he was only laying out Aristotle's conclusions, without rejecting Christian faith. But everyone knew the wound was open, because deep down, he had revealed something many were afraid to admit. Reason and faith do not always say the same thing, and when they clash, which one should win? Medieval Christian philosophy had tried to harmonize everything. Great thinkers like Thomas Aquinas had built systems where Aristotle worked as rational support for the truths of faith. The soul was immortal, of course, and Aristotle, reinterpreted, confirmed that. But Pomponazzi went too deep into the texts and saw there were tensions. And bravely, he refused to ignore them. He gave Aristotle back his original meaning and concluded that human reason is limited, and that the immortality of the soul, if it is true, is not a rational truth, but a truth of faith. This philosophical move, humble at its core but powerful in its consequences, was one of the early steps toward a secular way of thinking. He helped prepare the way for philosophy to become independent from theology. He influenced thinkers like Giordano Bruno, Descartes, and later Spinoza, who would also be persecuted for refusing to keep thought fully submissive to religion. But Pomponazzi also left an open dilemma. Is it possible to live with two truths, one rational truth and one truth of faith? Or by accepting that split, are we condemning ourselves to live divided, never fully free? That's the question many of his readers asked. And maybe that ambiguity is exactly the strength of his work. Because he doesn't offer a new certainty, he invites us to a kind of maturity, recognizing the limits of human knowledge. Not everything can be proven, not everything can be imposed. Between the arrogance of dogma and the emptiness of total skepticism, he chose philosophical honesty, and it was exactly that honesty that condemned him to centuries of obscurity. The church censored him, textbooks ignored him. His boldness was too uncomfortable to be taught. Only from the 19th century onward, with the rise of historical criticism and the rediscovery of Renaissance philosophers, did Pomponazzi start being studied seriously again. Today, he's seen as a transitional figure, neither medieval nor fully modern, but someone who dared to think at the limit. It's no coincidence that his philosophy was silenced. It shook the foundations of religious political power. The immortal soul was more than a metaphysical belief. It was the guarantee of a system of control. If the soul dies with the body, eternal punishment loses its force. Heaven and hell become just stories, and then obedience has to move. It can no longer come from fear. It has to depend on conscience. Pomponazzi knew that, and that's why, Even while saying he believed in the immortality of the soul, he claimed the right for reason to say something else. And that is maybe the greatest legacy he left us: the courage to think, even knowing that thinking might leave us alone. Giordano Bruno didn't look at the sky as a silent, orderly territory the way most of his contemporaries did. For him, the universe wasn't a fixed structure centered on Earth, but a living, infinite ocean where countless worlds revolved around distant stars. Most people saw darkness. Bruno saw movement, life, expansion. And paying for that vision would cost him his own body, burned alive in 1600 in a pyre lit by the Inquisition. In the 16th century, Europe was boiling with scientific discoveries and deep religious tension. The Protestant Reformation was challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, and Catholicism, feeling threatened, tightened its intellectual control even more. In this already explosive scenario, Bruno stepped in with a boldness many considered unbearable. He was a Dominican friar, trained in the very halls where dogma was strictest. But from a young age, he showed doubts no doctrine could tame. He questioned saints, rejected images, distrusted miracles. The cloister couldn't contain his mind, and maybe it was in that restricted environment that he developed his most dangerous conviction. Truth doesn't belong to authority. It belongs to the spirit that dares to think. Bruno left the convent and began a wandering life across Europe. In every city he fled to, Geneva, Paris, London, Wittenberg, he left behind a trail of heated debates. His philosophical imagination went far beyond the discussions of his time. While many were still trying to fit the Copernican model into the Christian worldview, Bruno took a huge leap. If the Earth goes around the sun, why would that sun be the only center? What if the universe has no center at all? What if there are infinite inhabited worlds? What if God is so vast that no doctrine can contain him? He was probably the first modern philosopher to openly defend an infinite cosmology, inspired partly by ancient atomism and partly by a deep spiritual intuition. A truly divine God couldn't be limited to a single world, a single sphere, a single sacred narrative. That's the key to understanding Bruno. He wasn't just a cosmologist, he was a philosophical mystic. His infinite universe was also a theological critique. Because if there are infinite worlds, the idea of a God who creates only one closed cosmos, with a single chosen people and a single salvation story, becomes far too small. And that was exactly what made him dangerous. For Catholic orthodoxy, Bruno didn't just threaten Aristotelian astronomy, he threatened the very foundation of institutional faith. He said that God is in all things, because all things are expressions of his infinitude. There is no special or privileged world. There is no single path to truth. There is no absolute center. It was, in essence, a radical pantheism that dissolved the borders between natural and divine. His famous line reflects this spirit. The universe is infinite because the image and likeness of God is infinite. That thought undermined central ideas of traditional Christianity, especially the idea of a personal God, separate from the world and ruling over creation. For Bruno, God was more like a fire burning in everything, a living principle that shows up in countless forms. A vision like that tore down the division between heaven and earth, matter and spirit, human and divine. Most of all, it tore down the religious authority that claimed exclusive access to the sacred. It's important to remember, Bruno wasn't offering a new, rigorous scientific model. He was offering a new philosophical vision of reality, an existential cosmology that broke with the medieval mindset. Science was still in its early stages, and many of his arguments were speculative. But his theoretical boldness was so deep it paved the way for much of modern thought. And it was that boldness, more than his specific conclusions, that bothered the church. For years, Bruno narrowly escaped arrest. In some places, he was protected by curious nobles. In others, he was expelled under accusations of heresy. Until, in 1592, he was finally arrested in Venice. Transferred to Rome, he faced 7 years of interrogations by the Inquisition. 7 years of psychological pressure, threats, doctrinal debates, and demands for recantation. But Bruno refused. If he recanted, he would save his life. But he would be lying against what he saw as the true vision of the cosmos. When his judges sentenced him, he is said to have replied, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it." The execution took place on February 17, 1600, in Piazza Campo dei Fiori. Bruno was burned alive, not for what he saw in the sky, but for what he saw in God. The silence imposed on his name lasted for centuries. The church tried to label him as crazy, a charlatan, or an irrelevant astrologer. Many historians reduced him to a martyr of science, as if he were only a victim of religious ignorance. But that's not enough. Bruno didn't die just for defending the heliocentric model. He died because he dared to free God from theological confinement. And here lies the real depth of his philosophy. Bruno imagined a cosmos with no center, where no institution could claim absolute truth. A universe where mystery doesn't belong to a book, but to existence itself. A creation too vast to fit inside a single doctrine. His death was an attempt to erase that vision, to restore order, contain the infinite, and silence imagination. But the fire that consumed him didn't destroy his ideas. On the contrary, it amplified their light. In the 19th century, Bruno became a symbol of intellectual freedom. In the 20th century, an inspiration for secular and humanist movements. In the 21st century, he's seen as a forerunner of modern cosmological thinking. And even today, his question still challenges us. Is it possible to imagine God without clinging to the borders of tradition? If the universe is infinite, what does that say about us? If there are other worlds, where does that leave human centrality? And if truth is bigger than any system, who has the right to silence it? Bruno didn't give final answers. He stirred the imagination, provoked reason, and shattered the comfort of ready-made certainties. His philosophy is an invitation to intellectual courage, to think without asking for permission. In a world that so often tries to domesticate human curiosity, Giordano Bruno is still a dangerous spirit, not because he threatens science or religion, but because he reminds us that free thought has no owner, no fence, no limit. And maybe that's why his story still makes people uneasy. The infinite cosmos he described is not just a theory, it's a mirror. A mirror in which we see reflected the question he paid with his life to defend. What is greater, the universe, or the human fear of knowing it? In a time of growing intolerance, when political power used religion as both shield and sword, one man raised his voice to say something simple but dangerous. Faith and reason are not enemies. His name was Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. Born in 1126 in the city of Córdoba in Al-Andalus, one of the brightest intellectual centers in Islamic history, doctor, judge, philosopher, astronomer, commentator on Aristotle, Averroes represented the legacy of a civilization that for centuries knew how to unite science, religion, and philosophy. But at the end of his life, everything he had defended was turned against him. He was pushed out of the Islamic world. His books were burned in public squares. He was exiled. And even in Christian Europe, where his work survived, he was censored, distorted, and labeled dangerous. Ibn Rushd was rejected for trying to bring together worlds that fanaticism wanted to keep apart. His life is a dramatic picture of what happens to those who believe that thinking, even while believing, is a duty, not a sin. From early on, Ibn Rushd dove into the study of Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, whose work he not only translated and commented on, but also reinterpreted in the light of Islam. His mission was clear: to show that truth is one, and that if there seem to be contradictions between revelation and reason, the problem is not in the truth itself, but in our limited understanding of it. In his boldest work, Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, he responds to a harsh attack on philosophy written by al-Ghazali, who had claimed that philosophers were dangerous to the faith and that certain doctrines should be fought aggressively. Al-Ghazali had argued that human reason, no matter how refined, cannot be trusted when it comes to divine mysteries. That trying to understand creation through reason was arrogance. Averroes did not deny faith, but he argued that God gave humanity reason as a noble tool for seeking knowledge. For him, to restrict thought was to insult the Creator himself. Truth does not contradict truth. What is true by reason cannot be false by faith. That was his core claim. Simple, powerful, dangerous. But this stance, which might sound balanced today, seemed like subtle heresy at the time. Averroes suggested that there are different levels of understanding truth. For ordinary people, the symbols and images of religion are enough. For legal scholars, rational interpretations of the scriptures are necessary. But for philosophers, the most prepared, it is possible to understand divine truths through logical reasoning. This idea was intellectually refined, but politically explosive, because it suggested that not everyone has to understand faith in the same way, and especially that philosophy has a legitimate place alongside religion. That unsettled conservative theologians and rulers who used religion as a tool of control. For much of his life, Averroes enjoyed the protection of the Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf, who admired the sciences and gave him important positions, such as court physician and qadi, judge. During this time, he wrote most of his philosophical works, commenting on almost all of Aristotle with such depth that centuries later he became known in the West simply as the commentator. But the political winds changed. When Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur came to power, a new wave of orthodoxy swept the Almohad Empire. The winds of philosophy started to be seen as dangerous. Averroes, once celebrated, was denounced, humiliated, and exiled. His books were burned publicly in Cordoba, and he spent his last years in Marrakesh, in silence, watching reason give way to fear. His exile was not only physical, it was symbolic. The attempt to reconcile faith and reason was declared unacceptable. Philosophy was pushed out of religious schools. Thinking was reduced to strict commentary on the Quran and literal obedience. The light of Islamic philosophy, which had shone with Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Al-Kindi, and Averroes himself, began to fade. But his work did not die there. In medieval Christian Europe, his ideas were preserved, ironically, through Latin translations made in Toledo. Averroes became a central figure in scholastic philosophy, especially among the so-called Latin Averroists, such as Siger of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia. These thinkers followed his idea of a double truth, a theological truth and a philosophical truth, which can coexist even if they don't immediately align. But this influence also troubled the Church. Averroist doctrines were condemned at several universities, like in Paris in the 13th century, for challenging the absolute authority of theology. The idea, held by some readers of Averroes, that the soul is not individual and immortal, but part of a universal intellect, clashed with the Christian doctrine of personal salvation. Once again, the philosopher was censored, now in the West. So Averroes was doubly rejected, in the Islamic world, for challenging literalists and fanatics. In Christian Europe, for disturbing the harmony between philosophy and faith that scholasticism tried to maintain. But what he was really proposing, at the core, was intellectual courage. Not a religion without faith, not a philosophy without spirituality, but a path where the human being approaches the divine by thinking, understanding, questioning, and his influence went far. Thomas Aquinas, even while criticizing Averroes, was deeply influenced by him. Dante Alighieri places him among the great wise men of history. In the Renaissance, his name reappeared as a symbol of suppressed reason, and in modern times, his legacy inspires debates on freedom of thought and secularism. What does Averroes represent today? In a world where fanaticism is once again on the rise, whether religious, ideological, or political, Averroes remains a necessary voice. He reminds us that faith that fears reason turns into superstition. and reason that denies all transcendence turns into arrogance. The ignorant person claims, the wise person doubts, the philosopher reflects, Hugh. This phrase, often attributed to him, might sum up his journey. A journey where thinking was seen as a dangerous act, but also as the deepest form of devotion. Averroes died in 1198, forgotten by many of his contemporaries, but his philosophy survived because true ideas are stronger than temporary censorship. Today, his name is remembered not only for his thoughts, but for his courage, the courage to think, even while surrounded by the flames of intolerance. Imagine a thinker who didn't just philosophize about the absolute, but said he had actually experienced the one in a state of ecstasy. A man who believed that the highest kind of knowledge isn't reached by deduction, but by contemplation. That ultimate truth is not something to be explained, but something to be lived. That man was Plotinus, the greatest representative of Neoplatonism, and one of the most profound and underrated philosophers of the ancient world. Plotinus lived in the 3rd century AD in a declining Rome, during the cultural transition between the classical world and the rising power of Christianity. He wrote a little over 50 treatises, later organized by his disciple Porphyry into a work called the Enneads. The impact of his ideas stretched across the centuries, but almost always under other people's names. That's because, although Plotinus was an independent, radical, mystical, and deeply original thinker, he was gradually absorbed into Christian theology, which read him through doctrinal lenses, reshaping his ideas to fit inside Christian metaphysics. The result? Plotinus was canonized without really being understood, and so, forgotten as a philosopher. Plotinus was never interested in popularity. According to Porphyry, he was ashamed of being in a body. He lived simply, avoided portraits, and saw matter as something lower, a veil between the soul and the one. His life was almost monastic, but his philosophy was grand, an attempt to describe the movement of the soul toward the source of all things. He called that source the One. Unlike the personal God of Christianity, Plotinus's one is not a will, not a being with attributes, not even a being at all. It is pure simplicity, prior to any duality, prior even to existence. It is the absolute ground, the source of everything, but it can't be grasped directly by thought. It can only be intuited in moments of spiritual elevation. For Plotinus, everything that exists flows out from the One, like light radiating from the sun. The first emanation is the nous, or intellect, where the forms reside, the pure ideas, like in Plato's metaphysics. Then, from the nous, comes the world soul, which gives life and order to the visible universe. And finally, we have the material world, the concrete reality where we live. The human soul, according to him, is a part of the world soul. It carries within itself the spark of the One, and because of that, it longs to return to it. But this return is not about going to a place. It's spiritual. It doesn't happen through dogma or belief, but through inner purification, ascetic practice, contemplation, and silence. Never miss the chance to return to yourself. Live in yourself. And if you don't yet find beauty in you, act like the sculptor who removes the excess stone until the form is revealed. Enneads, Mine 6, 9. These words reveal the heart of his philosophy. The soul must turn inward, detach from the senses, break with the ego, and in a rare state of union, dissolve into the One. This state is mystical, but not irrational. It's a kind of knowing higher than discursive knowledge, a seeing of the soul, not of the eyes, a form of knowing where subject and object are no longer separate, because they become one. But history did not preserve him as he truly was. Plotinus deeply influenced early Christian thinkers like St. Augustine, who read Neoplatonism as a bridge between Greek philosophy and Christian revelation. But to do that, it was necessary to reinterpret him. The One became God. The nous became the Logos. The world soul was pushed aside, and the idea of reincarnation, which appears in Plotinus, was dismissed as heresy. The richness of his symbolism and the radical nature of his mystical experience were traded for rigid theological structures. The doctrine of emanation, which described a fluid, dynamic universe, was reshaped into a system of creation ex nihilo, with a creator God separate from his creation. Neoplatonic ecstasy became the beatific vision of medieval theology. In other words, Plotinus was not really read. He was translated into another language. His ideas were filtered, molded, and in many ways drained of their philosophical power. During the Middle Ages, Plotinus's influence remained, but hidden. It shows up between the lines of Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, and later in the work of Marsilio Ficino during the Renaissance. But Plotinus's name almost never appeared. He was treated as a source of Christian mystical theology, not as a non-Christian philosopher with his own views. This silent appropriation had consequences. By losing his philosophical identity, Plotinus was reduced to a forerunner, a kind of pre-Christian without knowing it, and his original proposal of inner liberation was tied down to doctrines of external salvation. He had offered a spirituality of absolute interiority, where there are no intermediaries between human beings and the divine. Institutional Christianity, on the other hand, set up intermediaries, churches, priests, doctrines, sacraments. The direct experience of the one was replaced with ritual worship. The self-formation of the soul was replaced with submission to faith. That's why we can say Plotinus was forgotten as an independent thinker, not because he disappeared, but because he was silenced inside the very glory later attributed to him. Today, in a time of spiritual crisis, of exhausted religious forms, and of people searching for an authentic inner path, Plotinus reappears with new strength. His philosophy offers a way that doesn't depend on dogmas or orthodoxy, a path that starts in the soul itself and moves towards something greater, not as a belief, but as a transforming experience. In a world obsessed with material things, visibility, consumption, and speed, Plotinus reminds us that truth is found in turning inward, that self-knowledge is not a superficial practice, but a cosmic journey. And that philosophy doesn't have to be only analysis, critique, and debate. It can be elevation. Maybe that's why he was so quietly pushed aside, because his philosophy doesn't need intermediaries, and every structure of power, religious or political, is bothered by that kind of freedom. Plotinus didn't want to found sects or be canonized. He only wanted human beings to remember who they are. The soul that sees itself also sees the source from which it came. That source for him is not a God outside, but the one within, and that return to the center is, in the end, the most revolutionary kind of philosophy there is. Plotinus didn't die at the stake, wasn't exiled, and wasn't openly persecuted. But over time, he was reshaped until he became almost unrecognizable, and maybe that was an even subtler and deeper way of silencing him. Today, rediscovering Plotinus is more than an act of philosophical justice. It's an invitation to inner experience. It's a call to a way of living that doesn't settle for ready-made answers, but quietly seeks the unspeakable presence that holds everything together. In a world divided by castes, wars, and inherited privilege, one man dared to say that no one is more important than anyone else, that a peasant deserves as much respect as a king, and that there is no justice in spilling blood for honor, power, or tradition. That man was Mosey, and his philosophy, as radical as it is forgotten, is still one of the boldest in history. Mosey lived in China around the 5th century BCE, during the Warring States period, an era marked by violent conflicts between feudal lords, political instability, and widespread famine. It was also a time when different schools of thought were competing for the attention of rulers, each one claiming to hold the solution to restore order. Among them, Confucianism stood out with its defense of hierarchy, ritualized life, and obedience to tradition. Mosey, however, went in another direction. Unlike Confucius, who came from a minor noble family and saw morality as an extension of traditional social order, Mosey came from a humble background, and that shaped his entire worldview. He didn't believe that what is good comes from the past or from social status, but from a simple criterion, whether it is useful for everyone. For him, the basic moral standard was whatever promotes the common good, whatever feeds, protects, and unites people. If an action increases suffering or inequality, it is immoral. His philosophy, known as Mohism, was practical, rational, and universalist. Instead of rituals and lineages, Mozi valued concrete actions that benefited the people, and that put him in direct conflict with the intellectual elite of his time. Among many innovative principles Mozi defended, 3 stand out. 1. Genai, impartial care, or universal love. Unlike Confucianism, which prioritized family, ancestors, and social hierarchy, Mozi argued that love should be equal for everyone. Conflicts between people exist because each person loves only their own. If everyone loved each other equally, there would be no wars or injustices. This idea, called Jian'ai, was seen as shocking. How could someone love a stranger as much as a parent? For Mozi, the answer was clear. Real morality cannot be partial. Partial love, loving only those close to us, is the root of war and oppression. This proposal anticipated modern ideas about moral equality, distributive justice, and even human rights centuries before they appeared in the West. 2. Condemnation of war and militarism. At a time when wars were glorified as acts of bravery and legitimacy, Mozi said they were immoral, irrational, and useless. Killing one person is a crime. Killing thousands in a war is glory. Mozi denounced military campaigns, not only for the suffering they caused, but also for their selfish motivations. The greed of feudal lords, the desire for expansion, political pride. In his view, no war is just except defensive war to protect the people. He even organized groups of engineers and strategists to help cities defend themselves against invaders, promoting peace through tactical resistance. This practical pacifism made him not just a thinker, but a full-on political activist. 3. Merit. Instead of heredity. Mozi believed that authority should be based on competence, not on birth. In contrast with the Confucian obsession with tradition, he argued that a person's value lies in their actions and abilities. He proposed a system of government in which leaders would be chosen based on their moral and technical qualities, not on bloodline. Even today, this idea is revolutionary, and it posed a direct threat to the aristocracy and Confucian scholars whose legitimacy came from lineage and ritual knowledge. Given such advanced ideas, the question is inevitable. Why was Mozi forgotten? Why didn't his philosophy survive the way Confucius's did? The answer is power. With the unification of China under the Han Dynasty, Confucianism was raised to the status of official state doctrine. Its values, obedience, hierarchy, ancestor worship, fit perfectly into the imperial project. It was a philosophy that legitimized the ruler's power, organized society in a pyramid, and suppressed any idea of moral equality. Mohism, with its criticism of war, privilege, and favoritism, was simply too subversive. During the Han Dynasty, Mohist schools were shut down, their texts neglected, and the tradition practically wiped out. Mozi's thought was systematically erased, not just ignored, but actively opposed. The historical irony is brutal. The thinker who proposed universal love was cut out of the canon. The philosopher of peace was silenced by militarism. The defender of reason was defeated by tradition. If Mozi had been a thinker of the 18th century, he would have been an Enlightenment philosopher. If he lived today, he'd likely be a radical humanist. His emphasis on reason as a moral standard, his call for true meritocracy, his rejection of authoritarianism, and his belief in the unconditional equality of all human beings make him one of the great forerunners of modern ethical and political philosophy. He was, in a way, a kind of Chinese Rousseau before Rousseau. Or maybe the first non-Western Kantian, with his idea that actions should be judged by the good they produce universally, not by tradition or privilege. Mozi today, why bring him back? In a world still marked by wars, brutal inequalities, and institutional favoritism, Mosey remains a disturbing voice, and for that very reason, a necessary one. He reminds us that loving only our own is the first step toward hating everyone else. War is not noble. It's a moral failure. Hierarchy without merit is just oppression with a fancy label. Bringing Mosey back is also a way of challenging the systems of exclusion that still shape what we call official thought. His absence from textbooks, universities, and mainstream philosophical debates is not accidental. It is a political erasure. And like every erasure, it says more about power than about truth. Mosey was forgotten, but his ideas still confront us. In a time when hate speech is on the rise, when privilege disguises itself as merit, and when war is still sold as a solution, Mosey's philosophy is a stone in the shoe of civilization. He didn't want temples, dogmas, or glory. He wanted peace, justice, reason, and love without borders. And for that, the state silenced him. But if history is ever fair, it may still learn to hear him. In the heart of the Ethiopian mountains, far from European academies and Latin libraries, there lived a man who dared to make reason his absolute guide. He didn't have a university position, didn't found a school, and was never published in his own time. And yet he wrote one of the most extraordinary philosophical works of the 17th century. His name was Zera Yacob, and his story forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. The history of philosophy has been told almost entirely through European eyes, and because of that, he was forgotten. Zera Yacob was born in 1599 in Ethiopia, in a context of intense Christian religiosity and political tension. The country had been Christian since the 4th century, with its own unique Ethiopian tradition, separate from Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuit missionaries arrived, trying to convert the population to Roman Catholicism, which led to clashes with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and harsh religious persecution. It was in this environment, where faith was used as a tool of control and punishment, that Zera Yacob decided to flee oppression and retreat to a cave in the mountains near Axum. There, far from politics and imposed doctrine, he began a rational investigation into God, nature, morality, and the meaning of life. The result of this solitary reflection was an extraordinary work, the Hatata, a word that means inquiry or investigation in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. It is a philosophical treatise written around 1667, in which Zera Yacob does something very few people had done before. He rejects dogmas, questions religious traditions, and defends a universal morality based on reason. All of this outside the European world. Zera Yacob begins his work with a radical move. He places reason above religious authority. He writes that all religions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, contain elements of truth, but also of error, because they are created by limited human beings and are contaminated by power interests. Reason was placed in us by God as a light to guide us. Anything that goes against it, even if it comes from a holy book, cannot be accepted. This statement, written by an Ethiopian Christian in the 17th century, anticipated ideas from the European Enlightenment that would only gain strength decades later with thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, or Kant. But Zera Yacob reached these conclusions on his own, far from the salons of Paris, through deep personal reflection, rooted in his own life experience. His philosophy is a rare example of universalist rationalism outside the European sphere. And maybe for that very reason, it was systematically ignored by historians of philosophy. Zera Yacob didn't fit the Eurocentric narrative that tied rational thought only to Greece, Latin Christianity, and the Enlightenment. One of the boldest aspects of the Hatata is the way Zera Yacob treats religious scriptures. He analyzes biblical passages with a critical eye, questioning the morality of certain practices and laws. For example, when commenting on the taboo around menstruating women, he writes, "The menstruating woman is despised. But who created her this way, if not God? Why then should she be impure?" This kind of reasoning shows a way of thinking that starts from concrete experience and refuses to accept an authority just because it is ancient or called sacred. For Zera Jacob, experience and reason are legitimate sources of moral knowledge, more reliable than unquestioned traditions. He also rejects fasting as a religious virtue, saying there is no merit in making the body suffer for no real reason. The same goes for celibacy and other religious sacrifices imposed as proof of faith. His ethics are always focused on real life, well-being, harmony between people, and harmony with nature. Zera. Jacob believed in God, but not in a God who demands blind obedience. His God is rational, creator of an ordered world that should be understood through the light of the human mind. And it is precisely because God is just that he gave human beings reason to distinguish right from wrong. God does not contradict himself. He created reason to be our guide, and he will judge us according to it. This view brings Zera Jacob close to philosophers like Spinoza, Descartes, or Leibniz, even though he never read their works, which makes his philosophy even more impressive. He developed a rationalist system independent of the European tradition, guided only by observation, moral intuition, and logical analysis. He believed the universe follows an order, and that the human soul can grasp this order not through miraculous revelations, but through our inborn rational capacity. That means Zera Jacob anticipated, within African Christian tradition, a deeply Enlightenment-style view of reason and ethics. Given how powerful his work is, the inevitable question is, why was Zera Jacob ignored in the history of philosophy? The answer is simple and uncomfortable: because he wasn't European. The Western philosophical canon, built from the 18th century onward, was based on a story that tied rational thought to the white Christian West. Everything outside that, Africa, the Americas, the East, was treated as folklore, spirituality, or lower culture, never as philosophy with a capital P. Zera Jacob was a victim of this structural prejudice. His work only started to become known in the West in the 20th century, after it was translated from Ge'ez into French. Even then, it remained marginal in philosophy courses, rarely cited in textbooks, almost never mentioned next to the great names. But his marginalization says more about the blindness of history than about the quality of his thought. By bringing Zera Jacob back, we're not just diversifying the canon, we're recognizing a forgotten greatness. His philosophy is not exotic or alternative. It is universal, deeply rational, and still very relevant. In times of fundamentalism, culture wars, and religious intolerance, he reminds us that faith doesn't have to be irrational, that reason is not the enemy of God, that morality doesn't come from imposition, but from understanding, and above all, that philosophy belongs to all peoples. Zera Jacob was not forgotten by accident. He was forgotten because his thought challenged two powerful forces, religious dogmatism and academic Eurocentrism. But today, as we remember his calm, critical voice, as we rediscover the Hatata, as we embrace his legacy, we're correcting a historical injustice. And more than that, we're reconnecting with an African source of universal wisdom that still has a lot to teach us. Imagine a priest isolated in the French countryside in the 17th century. On the outside, he follows every rule of the church, celebrates Mass, gives the sacraments, counsels the faithful, obeys the hierarchy. But on the inside, he hates every word he preaches. Day after day, he supports other people's faith, while secretly writing the most devastating text against religion ever produced up to that time. That man was Jean Méliès, and his story is one of the most explosive and silenced in the history of modern philosophy. He lived from 1664 to 1729 in a deeply Catholic France where heresy was a crime and atheism was unthinkable. He spent more than 40 years as a parish priest in a rural village, Étrépigny, without ever drawing attention. To the people around him, he was just another priest, quiet, devout, obedient. But in secret, Méliès was writing, and what he wrote was both a philosophical confession and a furious attack on all religion. Jean Méliès never published anything while he was alive. Everything we know about his real thinking comes from a manuscript found after his death in 1729, titled Memoir Against Religion, often called his Testament. It was a huge volume, more than 600 handwritten pages, in which he confessed himself an atheist, a materialist, anti-monarchist, and radically anti-clerical, a direct, sharp text, full of irony, pain, and indignation. I wish that all the great ones of the world, the nobles and the tyrants, were hanged with the guts of the priests. This phrase, later popularized in the French Enlightenment, is attributed to Meslier, and it sums up the rage pouring through his work. But how could a priest get to that point? And why did he stay in the job until his death? The answer is in his context. In 17th century France, under Louis XIV, church and state walked hand in hand. The clergy had privileges, the Catholic faith was mandatory, and censorship was brutal. Simply expressing public doubt about the existence of God could mean prison, torture, or death. Meslier, who came from a humble background, entered the priesthood as a way to gain social status and stability. But over the years he watched the hypocrisy of the clergy, the suffering of the people, religious exploitation, and peasants' misery funding bishops' palaces. And all of that ate away at him from the inside. He didn't leave the priesthood, not because he was a coward, but because he understood that only by living inside the system could he denounce it in depth. And that's what he did. He wrote his testament not for himself, but so it would be found after his death. It was his final and definitive sermon against everything he had spent his life preaching. Meslier's thinking is straightforward. God does not exist. Religion is a human invention to keep people submissive. Kings are tyrants, and priests are accomplices of the lie. His arguments anticipate many of the attacks that would later be made by Voltaire, Diderot, D'Holbach, and Marx, but with a rawness that is uniquely his. For Meslier, faith is built on fear and ignorance. Miracles are frauds or delusions. Morality does not depend on religion. The Bible is full of contradictions, cruelty, and absurdities. The clergy is a parasitic class that lives off the exploitation of the poor. All priests preach resignation because they want the people to accept their misery while they live in comfort. For him, Christianity is not a religion of love, but of power, a system designed to convince the poor they must suffer in this life to deserve happiness in the next. A happiness that, in reality, doesn't exist. Besides being an atheist, Meslier was also a materialist. He believed that only matter exists, that there is no immortal soul, and that consciousness is a product of the body. Ideas that totally clashed with the dominant metaphysics of his time. In this sense, Meslier was an early voice of philosophical naturalism, arguing that nature operates by physical laws, not by divine interventions. But his philosophy wasn't just theoretical, it was ethical and political. He didn't write for intellectual elites. He wrote in defense of the poor, the peasants, the oppressed. He attacked monarchy as a system of oppression, and Christianity as the opium that makes people passively accept injustice. More than a century before Marx, Jean Meslier already saw religion as an ideological tool of domination. The poor are deceived twice, on earth and in heaven. When his testament was discovered, it shocked the few who read it, but it was quickly suppressed. It circulated secretly in handwritten copies, passed from hand to hand among Enlightenment thinkers. Voltaire, although he admired the force of the text, thought it was too brutal for the public. He published a softened, censored version, without the direct attacks on faith, with a deist tone Meslier himself would never have accepted. That move reveals something curious. Even free thinkers of the 18th century hesitated to show the full radicalism of Jean Meslier. His complete work was only published many years later in the 19th century, and even then stayed on the margins of official philosophy history. Meslier was silenced twice. First, by the fear of death, which forced him into anonymity. Then, by the hypocrisy of an Enlightenment that still wasn't ready to hear his voice in full. Jean Meslier was the first modern philosopher to openly declare himself an atheist in a full-length treatise, not as a provocation, but as a philosophical and political conviction, and he paid for it with his own identity. He spent his whole life pretending to be someone he wasn't, so that after his death, he could finally be heard as he truly was. His text is not just an atheist manifesto, it's a cry for liberation, an accusation against systems of spiritual domination, a passionate defense of reason, justice, and moral autonomy. Jean Meslier died alone, but he left an immeasurable legacy. He didn't found schools. He had no disciples, but he planted a seed that would grow in the centuries that followed. The courage to think against everything that seemed untouchable. In times of fanaticism, dogmatism, and religious manipulation, his voice echoes as a reminder that blind faith can be as oppressive as any tyranny, and that sometimes, to protect the truth, you have to live it in silence until the world is ready to hear it. While philosophers across Europe were celebrating the clarity of math, the precision of geometry, and the universality of the laws of physics, a solitary man with a deep voice and dense writing dared to say the opposite. The center of human knowledge isn't in math, it's in history. That man was Giambattista Vico, a Neapolitan thinker from the 17th century who lived far from the big intellectual centers of his time, and was just as ignored by the official history of philosophy for a long time. In the middle of the so-called Age of Reason, when Cartesian rationalism and English empiricism dominated the debates, Vico wrote a work that seemed to move in the opposite direction. Scienza Nuova, New Science, published in 1725, where he argued that the true science of human beings isn't in equations, but in myths, language, customs, and institutions. It was a bold move, and for many impossible to understand. To really grasp the impact of Vico's work, you have to place him in his time. The 17th century was marked by a huge intellectual revolution. Descartes, with his mathematics of thought, had set up a new ideal of certainty. Only what is clear, distinct, and deducible, like numbers, can be called true. That view deeply shaped modern science, epistemology, and the very idea of what counts as valid knowledge. Philosophy started chasing mathematical and mechanical models, pushing aside everything that seemed subjective, cultural, or particular. Truth, people believed, should be impersonal, abstract, timeless. Vico, however, saw something deeply wrong in that project. He didn't reject reason, but he exposed how limited it becomes when applied to what is human. Mathematics gives us certainty, but not wisdom. For Vico, math is a creation of the human mind that works inside closed systems. But human life, in all its complexity, politics, language, religion, poetry, art, doesn't fit inside that model. The human being is not a mechanism, but a historical, symbolic, narrative being. Vico's big revolution was to say that we can only truly know what we ourselves have made. This principle, which he calls verum ipsum factum, the true is the made, flips modern epistemology on its head. If math is true because we made it and understand all its rules, then history can also be true, because we made history. We are the authors of our institutions, our laws, our cultures. So, to study these things is to study humanity in its own creations. Vico's project was to create a new science, a science of history, society, language, and culture, based not on numbers, but on the poetic imagination that shapes human consciousness over time. He saw civilization as a spiral process where peoples move through three stages: Age of the Gods, ruled by myth, the sacred, and poetry; Age of Heroes, marked by aristocracies and codes of honor; Age of Men, dominated by reason, law, and reflection. This cyclical, symbolic view of history was totally different from the straight, linear story told by rationalism. For Vico, history isn't noise, but a voice that needs to be heard and interpreted, not thrown away as irrational. It's not hard to see why Vico was ignored. While philosophers of his time were chasing universality and the neutrality of mathematical reason, Vico was defending the value of what is particular symbolic, and cultural. While Enlightenment thinkers preached the light of science against the darkness of myth, Vico saw myth as the very origin of consciousness. The Academy, more and more shaped by the scientific models of Newton, Descartes, and Locke, didn't know what to do with Vico. His style was hard to read, his concepts were too new, his ideas didn't match the dominant spirit of the age. He stayed isolated in Naples, fighting for recognition, often mocked by his contemporaries. He died without seeing his work understood. And for centuries, his new science stayed on the margins of philosophy, treated as interesting, but harmless. But the truth is, Vico was way ahead of his time. What he proposed in the 18th century would only start to be appreciated in the 19th, with thinkers like Herder, Hegel, and Dilthey, and later in the 20th century with Gadamer, Ricoeur, Cassirer, Michel Foucault, and others. Today, Vico is recognized as a forerunner of the human sciences, of hermeneutics, of the philosophy of culture, and of the history of ideas. He anticipated the critique of abstract rationalism, showing that human beings can only be understood through their historicity, their language, and their institutions. Men make history, but they don't make it however they want. They make it as they can, with the symbolic tools they create. This way of seeing things forces us to understand knowledge not as the discovery of eternal truths, but as an ongoing interpretation of the world we ourselves are creating. Why was Vico silenced? Vico was silenced because his philosophy didn't serve the ideal of rational and scientific progress that shaped modern Western thought. His appreciation of tradition, mythical language, popular culture, and history clashed with a project that saw the past as superstition and the future as total rationalization. By defending the idea that wisdom is found in poetry, religion, oral tradition, and popular beliefs, Vico challenged intellectual hierarchies and systems that tried to strictly separate knowledge from belief. On top of that, his critique of rationalism wasn't a rejection of reason. It was a defense of embodied, situated, human reason. And that, for many, was more threatening than irrationalism itself. It was a reminder that reason alone is not enough to understand human beings. Today, Vico is more and more appreciated, not as a curiosity, but as a master of complexity. He teaches us that culture is a living creation, that myths aren't just illusions, but symbolic forms that structure thought, that knowledge isn't only calculation, but also memory, imagination, and narrative. His thought questions the usual oppositions between reason and emotion, science and art, nature and history. He shows that to understand human beings, we need more than formulas. We need listening, interpretation, and empathy. Giambattista Vico wasn't forgotten by accident. He was pushed aside because his philosophy didn't fit the rationalist project that ruled European thought for centuries. But maybe that's exactly why he's one of the most necessary thinkers for our time. In a world that's increasingly technical, abstract, and dehumanized, Vico invites us to put history, language, and imagination back at the center of knowledge. Not to deny reason, but to free it from its own prison. In times of oppression, some people resist with swords, others with fiery speeches. Zhuangzi resisted with laughter, metaphors, and butterflies. He didn't found a school, didn't write dogmas, didn't try to reform society. He did something bigger. He took apart every certainty, including the moral, political, and linguistic certainties that hold power in place. If Confucius is the thinker of order, social ethics, and hierarchy, Zhuangzi is the thinker of deviation, doubt, and a kind of freedom that refuses to be tied to any fixed form. He was a philosophical anarchist in the best sense of the term. He rejected all imposed structures, especially those that claim the right to say what is right, good, just, or true in the name of the state. His thought was so radical that, during periods of imperial centralization and authoritarian rule in China, it simply disappeared from curricula, debates, and social practices. Zhuangzi, the Taoist libertarian, was not silenced for being violent, but for being absolutely free. Zhuangzi lived around the 4th century BCE, during what is known as the Warring States period, a time when Chinese states fought for power, expanded their bureaucracies, and solidified moral and political codes. It was also a time of intense philosophical activity, with many schools competing for influence. Among them, Confucianism was gaining strength, defending public morality, hierarchical order, rituals, and social harmony, all subordinated to the ideal of a wise and centralized state. But Zhuangzi looked at all that with deep suspicion. He didn't see laws and rituals as a path to harmony, but as tools of domestication. For him, a civilization organized by the state is a form of violence disguised as virtue. The greatest thieves wear crowns and have ministers. Unlike the Confucians, who argued that rulers should be wise and moral to guide the people, Zhuangzi believed the wisest government is the one that doesn't govern, the one that lets things flow according to the Tao, the natural way of things. State morality, for Zhuangzi, is an artificial construction. It defines what is good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust, not based on truth, but on the convenience of power. When the state defines what virtue is, it also defines who is vicious, and with that, it justifies punishment, exclusion, and war. The sages of old didn't teach goodness. They avoided interfering in the natural course of life. Zhuangzi exposes this official morality by showing that ethical categories are relative, changeable, and subjective. What is moral in one culture is immoral in another. What is right for the ruler can be disastrous for the people. His philosophy reminds us that morality isn't an essence, it's a language, and any language can be manipulated. One of Zhuangzi's sharpest targets is language itself, especially the language used by power. With irony and metaphors, he shows how words create fake divisions, life and death, good and evil, useful and useless, self and other. All of these distinctions are mental limits, not absolute realities. How do I know if I am a man dreaming I am a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming I am a man? This famous passage isn't just poetic, it's a devastating critique of the way we build certainty. If we can't even be sure about who is dreaming whom, what value do fixed rules imposed by rulers really have when they claim to define what is real or true? Zhuangzi knew that the language of the state hides behind a mask of rationality, but in practice is an instrument of control. When the state defines what is normal, it automatically marginalizes everything that escapes that definition. When it defines virtue, it also authorizes punishment in the name of that virtue. Zhuangzi didn't propose political revolutions. He didn't want to seize power or offer a new public morality. His revolution went deeper. He wanted to free the human spirit from forms, from fixed categories, from imposed obligations. His philosophy is a kind of existential anarchism, living according to the Tao, the natural flow of life, without forcing anything, without imposing anything, without seeking power. The true sage, for him, is the one who doesn't interfere, doesn't judge, and doesn't want to rule. The perfect person has no ego. The wise person has no doctrine. The enlightened person has no name. This deeply libertarian vision makes him incompatible with any project of political centralization. That's why Zhuangzi was often erased during authoritarian imperial periods in China. While Confucianism was promoted as the official doctrine, with its clear rules, rigid social ethics, and ideal of obedience, Zhuangzi's thought was seen as dangerous, subversive, even nihilistic. Zhuangzi doesn't argue like a logician or a moralist. He tells stories. Stories about men who lose their feet and become wise. Stories about fish arguing over whether they're happy. Stories about masters laughing at the moment of death. These narratives aren't just funny. They're philosophical attacks disguised as humor. Zhuangzi knew that laughter can free more than anger ever could. He knew that power depends on seriousness, and that laughter can take apart entire systems. By laughing at authority, at imposed morality, at dogmatic language, Zhuangzi creates space for doubt, lightness, and the freedom to exist without being defined. Zhuangzi wasn't lost because his ideas were obscure, but because they were dangerously clear. In a culture that valued order, discipline, and imperial authority, he was like a cracked mirror. He showed that all of that was a fragile construction. During eras when China was ruled by strong centralized governments, especially under dynasties like Han, Tang, and Qing, Confucianism was enforced as state doctrine. Zhuangzi, with his fierce critique of authority, was pushed to the margins, forgotten, or reinterpreted in a harmless way. It took until the 20th century, with the collapse of empires and the rise of new libertarian ways of thinking, for Zhuangzi to be rediscovered as one of the deepest thinkers of inner and social freedom. We live in an age where political authorities fight over moral narratives, where social media amplifies binary speeches, right and wrong, patriots and traitors, friends and enemies, where language is used to label, silence, and punish. Zhuangzi offers us a powerful philosophical antidote. He invites us to distrust absolute truths, imposed moralities, and fixed identities, to remember that everything is in flux, that what is right today might be wrong tomorrow, that living well is flowing with life, not forcing forms onto it. Don't try to bend the world to your will. Bend with the world, and you will never be broken. Zhuangzi didn't want to create a new system. He wanted you to notice that all systems are constructions. He didn't offer an alternative morality. He offered the freedom to live without compulsory morality. And that's why he was forgotten, because real freedom scares people far more than oppression ever does. In a culture that tries to pin down truths, build systems, and offer final answers, Heraclitus was, and still is, a disturbance. He didn't offer answers. He offered riddles. He didn't say what the world is. He said that everything that is already in the process of no longer being. Everything flows. Nothing stays the same. Fai. That sentence, one of the most quoted and least understood in the history of philosophy, sums up the core of Heraclitus's thought. Reality is movement, change, constant tension. But why then was such a deep thinker reduced to the nickname the Obscure One? Why, instead of taking him as a starting point for Western thought, did we prefer to follow Parmenides, his opposite, or Plato, who softened his radical view? The answer says a lot more about the history of philosophy than it does about Heraclitus himself. Heraclitus was born in Ephesus around the 6th century BCE, a vibrant Greek city-state connected to the sea, trade, and cultural diversity. But despite living in a world of flow and exchange, he was a solitary thinker, critical of the masses and hostile to easy opinions. He didn't hang around philosophical schools. He didn't create a circle of disciples. He wrote a single book, now lost except for fragments, and left it in the temple of Artemis. It was an offering to the divine, not a manual for human beings. That's why so many of his thoughts reach us in short, paradoxical, poetic fragments. It's not that he wanted to be obscure, it's that he knew truth doesn't fit into simple formulas. Nature loves to hide. Heraclitus believed that reality shows itself in tension, friction, and the clash between opposites. What we call stability is just a temporary moment in a flow that never stops. It's like the river in his famous saying, "You can't step into the same river twice." But he goes even further. Not even once, because the waters have already changed, and so have you. Right after Heraclitus, another thinker appeared to defend the exact opposite, Parmenides, with his idea that being is one, unchanging, eternal, and all change is an illusion. Parmenides claimed that thinking about non-being is impossible. What is not cannot be thought. So everything that changes, everything that is no longer what it was, is illusion. This way of thinking deeply influenced Plato, who ended up creating his famous theory of eternal ideas, separating the sensible world, changing, illusory, from the intelligible world, fixed, perfect. It was this path, the path of a fixed, unchanging being, that became dominant in the West. Philosophical tradition went looking for what doesn't change, what is stable, eternal, universal. Heraclitus's thought, centered on becoming, on flow, on impermanence, was labeled obscure, irrational, pre-Socratic. But maybe he was pushed aside precisely because he touched something essential that makes us uncomfortable: the fact that nothing lasts, and the world as we know it is always in transition. Why was Heraclitus minimized? Heraclitus wasn't sidelined just for philosophical reasons. It also has to do with a deep cultural need for stability. The medieval church, for example, needed an eternal, unmoving, absolute God. In that context, change sounded like disorder, heresy, chaos. In the Enlightenment, philosophers were searching for solid foundations for knowledge, rational certainties, fixed laws of nature, universal moral principles. Heraclitus didn't offer any of that. He offered flow, conflict, impermanence. And because of that, his philosophy didn't fit into systems and couldn't serve as a base for traditional metaphysics. On top of that, the language he used, fragmented, symbolic, aphoristic, didn't match the scientific or systematic style that became the ideal throughout the history of philosophy. He sounded more like a prophetic poet than like an academic, and so he was pushed aside. One of Heraclitus's central concepts is the logos, a hard word to translate, which can mean reason, structure, order, meaning. But for him, the logos is not formal logic, and it's not some revealed truth. It's the dynamic principle that organizes the cosmos, not despite contradiction, but through it. War is the father of all things. With that, Heraclitus isn't glorifying violence. He's showing that the world comes into being through opposing forces. Day and night, hot and cold, life and death, everything exists because its opposite exists. The cosmos, for him, is like a bow or a lyre. There is tension and harmony only because there's conflict between extremes. That's the wisdom of becoming. Not trying to eliminate the opposite, but understanding that reality balances itself through change. Heraclitus may have been pushed into the background for centuries, but today he returns with renewed strength. We live in an age marked by ruptures, instability, technological and ecological transformation, where old certainties are collapsing in the face of a world in constant flux. And suddenly, that obscure thinker starts to sound strangely clear. Heraclitus teaches us that nothing is fixed, and trying to fix everything is denying reality itself. Time is not an enemy. It's the very structure of existence. Truth is not a formula. It's a process in motion. His view of the world anticipates dialectical thinking, influences existentialism, echoes in phenomenology, and even speaks to contemporary physics with its theories of fields, waves, and processes. It was in the 19th century, with Friedrich Nietzsche, that Heraclitus started to be revalued as the father of tragic philosophy. Nietzsche saw in Heraclitus a pre-Socratic resistance to metaphysical rationalism, a philosophy that embraces the flow of life instead of denying it. Heraclitus is right. Being is a fiction. The real world is becoming. With Nietzsche, Heraclitus stops being the obscure one and becomes the clear-sighted one, the thinker who saw from the very beginning that life can't be contained in logical schemes, and that every attempt to freeze reality is a way of denying its vitality. It's important to be clear. Heraclitus wasn't surpassed by Parmenides, Plato, or Aristotle. He was avoided. His radical view is scary because it pulls the ground out from under our feet. It forces us to give up the illusion that there is a fixed point, an unchanging essence, a final truth. But maybe Heraclitus's greatest lesson is exactly this: to embrace change as the essence of life, to accept conflict as part of harmony, to see in impermanence not the end of truth, but its very way of being. The history of philosophy tried to hide Heraclitus in the name of clarity, reason, and order. But today, in the middle of chaos, transformation, and uncertainty, he returns as a necessary voice, not to give us answers, but to free us from the obsession with final truths. Because deep down, Heraclitus was never obscure. What was obscure was our attempt to erase the movement of life. In almost every established spiritual tradition, there comes a point where questioning stops being a virtue and starts being seen as a threat. An invisible line is drawn, and whoever crosses it is often forgotten, silenced, or badly misunderstood. Chandrakirti was one of those thinkers. A 7th century Indian Buddhist monk from the Madhyamaka school of Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti didn't just deepen the idea that all phenomena are empty, he pushed that logic to the limit, taking apart even Buddhism's own concepts. He dared to say, there is no path, no enlightenment, no nirvana as fixed essences. And because of that, he was put aside for centuries in several Buddhist traditions that wanted to stabilize themselves on pillars he refused to treat as final. Chandrakirti was one of the main systematizers of Madhyamaka philosophy, founded by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century. This school offers a radical view of reality. Everything is empty of inherent existence. There is no essence behind things, no permanent self, no ultimate truth that can be captured in concepts. But Chandrakirti went even further than Nagarjuna. He didn't just deny the essential reality of things. He also denied the status of the very philosophical categories used to say what is or isn't. In his most famous work, the Madhyamakavatara, Introduction to the Middle Way, he describes the stages of the Buddhist path, but does it as a kind of built-in paradox. While he describes the path, he also takes apart its foundations. For him, there is no fixed path. Talking about stages, merit, purification, wisdom, all of that is skillful means, teaching tools, but not final truths. Even nirvana, seen by many Buddhists as the final state, is empty of intrinsic existence. Nirvana is not different from samsara, and samsara is not different from nirvana. That famous line, coming from Nagarjuna and reinforced by Chandrakirti, shakes any spiritual morality built on linear progress, personal achievement, or final rewards. Chandrakirti was fighting a very common mistake, even among Buddhist philosophers: conceptual reification. In other words, the tendency to turn a useful concept into an absolute truth. Saying everything is empty can quickly turn into believing emptiness is the ultimate reality, which for him is a serious misunderstanding. He insisted that shunyata, emptiness, is not an essence, but a denial of confusion. Emptiness is not a thing in itself, but the realization that nothing can be pinned down by thoughts or words. So even the concept of emptiness is empty. That's Chandrakirti's boldness. He applies emptiness even to the Buddhist teaching itself. He doesn't want the student to believe. He wants the student to see. And to see, in this sense, is to let go even of the idea of seeing. In his philosophical approach, Chandrakirti uses a specific style of argument called prasanga, which is based not on building positive theses, but on reducing others' positions to absurdity. He doesn't offer an alternative theory. He shows that all theories are inconsistent when pushed to their limits. That sets him apart from other Buddhist schools, like Svatantrika Madhyamaka, which tried to offer positive arguments about reality. Chandrakirti rejected that kind of construction. For him, every statement is ultimately relative and must be let go of. Philosophy should not build systems, it should break attachments. This makes him deeply close in spirit to philosophical skepticism, and interestingly, even to certain postmodern views that distrust every grand narrative. Chandrakirti's boldness lies in his internal critique of Buddhism itself. He saw that, over time, the Buddha's teachings were being turned into a system with fixed rules, metaphysical structures, and clear promises. But the Buddha himself had already warned against that. He used upaya, skillful means, metaphors, parables, teaching strategies, to help students arrive at direct insight into reality. Not so they would cling to the methods. Chandrakirti inherits that spirit and pushes it to the end. He shows that the whole philosophical and ritual structure can become a barrier if taken as literal truth. And by doing this, he criticizes not just outside religions, but the dogmatism that can grow inside Buddhism. It's no surprise then that Chandrakirti was marginalized or downplayed in many orthodox Buddhist traditions. In schools that wanted to systematize practices, define stages, organize spiritual hierarchies, and stabilize doctrines, a thinker who refuses any conceptual stability was simply incompatible. His approach threatened the very project of institutionalizing Buddhism because it undercut the desire for doctrinal clarity and control. While other schools promised clear paths to enlightenment, Chandrakirti was basically saying, no doctrine is truly safe. Cling to it, and you lose your freedom. So for centuries, he was ignored, mentioned only superficially, or reinterpreted in a harmless way. His philosophical radicalism was fully rediscovered and appreciated mainly in Tibet, in the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition, especially thanks to Tsongkhapa in the 14th century, and, more recently, by modern scholars in the West. In a world where ideologies show up as final solutions, and where even spirituality becomes a market and a technique, Chandrakirti sounds more current than ever. He invites us to distrust every certainty, including spiritual ones, refuse attachment to systems, even subtle inner ones, see emptiness as freedom, not as a theory, quiet the mind that needs to fix meanings, and open space for a direct, non-dual way of seeing. In times of polarization and fundamentalism, including religious and spiritual fundamentalism, Chandrakirti offers a freeing vision. It's not about trading one dogma for another, but about going beyond the very need for dogma. Chandrakirti was forgotten, not because his thinking lacked depth, but because it was too deep to be domesticated. He breaks the habit of turning philosophy into a system, Buddhism into a rigid religion, and wisdom into a formula. His work is a constant call to inner freedom, not as some mystical status, but as a critical, lucid, and compassionate stance toward the world. The philosopher who dreamed of a republic of reason and was silenced by the dogmas of two worlds, amid the noise of religious wars and the rise of strict theological orthodoxy, a thinker appeared in the Islamic world who dared to imagine a state led not by priests or conquerors, but by philosophers. Al-Farabi, called by many the second teacher, the first being Aristotle, was the Plato of Islam, a universal mind who tried to bring faith, reason, and politics into harmony at a time when that harmony was becoming less and less possible. But like so many who thought beyond their own age, Al-Farabi was forgotten, distorted, or pushed to the margins by both the Christian West and Orthodox Islamic theologian, and his philosophical project, a politics grounded in reason and virtue, is more relevant today than ever. Al-Farabi was born around the year 872, probably in Farab in Central Asia, in what is now Kazakhstan. His intellectual life, however, flourished in Baghdad, one of the great centers of medieval Islamic learning. There, in a period of intense cultural and scientific activity, works by Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, and other Greek thinkers were being translated into Arabic. But Al-Farabi didn't stop at translating. He reinterpreted these texts, combined them with Islamic thought, and developed his own philosophy, deeply focused on politics, ethics, and metaphysics. His vision was ambitious: to build a universal philosophy that did not separate religion from reason, nor politics from wisdom, and what he proposed was nothing short of revolutionary. Inspired by Plato and Aristotle, Al-Farabi wrote one of the most important works of Islamic political philosophy, Al-Madina al-Fadila, the Virtuous City. In this treatise, he describes an ideal society ruled by a philosopher leader, not very different from Plato's philosopher king in the Republic. But Al-Farabi goes further. For him, the virtuous city is one where reason guides collective decisions, and moral education is the core of public life. The goal of politics is not power or obedience, but happiness, al-sa'ada, understood as the full realization of reason and the soul. The purpose of human existence is the perfection of the soul, and the role of politics is to create the conditions for this perfection to flourish. He classifies types of cities or regimes based on their relationship to virtue: the virtuous city, ruled by wisdom and justice; the ignorant city, where people live only for pleasure or wealth, without caring for the common good; the wicked or corrupt city, which knows what virtue is but consciously rejects it. This typology shows his realism. He doesn't idealize the world, but offers philosophical criteria to judge political systems. Al-Farabi also had a very sophisticated view of religion. For him, religion and philosophy are not enemies, but different languages expressing the same truth. Philosophy is the path of reason and concepts. Religion is the path of images and stories. Both have value, as long as they don't claim absolute power over everything. Religion is the imaginative representation of philosophical truth. This idea was widely misunderstood and dangerously bold for Orthodox Islamic theologians. Suggesting that religion depends on philosophy was unacceptable. For Christian theologians in the West, treating Islam as a legitimate way to truth was also heresy. So, Al-Farabi ended up caught between two fires. He was too rationalist for Islamic Orthodox scholars who feared that philosophy would undermine faith, and he was too Muslim for Christian scholastics, who showed little interest in his work, even though they studied Aristotle through Arabic sources. Over time, the Islamic world began to close in on itself. The rise of more conservative legal and theological schools, like the Ash'arites, marked a turn against the influence of Greek philosophy. Thinkers like Al-Ghazali attacked the philosophers' trust in reason and argued that some aspects of faith were beyond reason, or that reason could even be dangerous. In that climate, Al-Farabi was slowly pushed aside. His cosmopolitan ideas, his ideal of a city ruled by philosophers, his distinction between symbolic religion and rational truth, all of this clashed with the project of theological and political centralization in medieval Muslim empires. In the Latin West, even though philosophers like Thomas Aquinas were influenced by Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who himself drew on Al-Farabi, Al-Farabi's own name almost disappeared from philosophy manuals. He was simply too inconvenient to celebrate. Al-Farabi was not just a political philosopher. He was a truly cosmopolitan thinker. He believed that all human societies can, to some degree, take part in the search for virtue and rational happiness. He did not see religious, ethnic, or cultural borders as final or absolute. His virtuous city could be built anywhere people were willing to bring reason and moral practice into conversation. This vision goes beyond religious tribalism and affirms a shared ethical ground for humanity, something incredibly bold for his time. The true community is the one united by wisdom, not by origin. This universalist view makes him not only a precursor of Renaissance humanism, but also a crucial thinker for today's ethical and political debates. In a world more and more polarized between fanaticism and cynicism, between rigid dogmas and empty relativism, Al-Farabi's proposal comes back as a forgotten and urgent alternative. He shows that politics should be guided by the common good, not blind faith or brutal pragmatism. Religion can live alongside reason, if it accepts its symbolic role and not an absolute one. Philosophy has a public role to play, not as distant theory, but as practical guidance for collective life. His project is not utopian, it's demanding. It calls for education, virtue, dialogue, and openness to truth. And exactly because of that, it was rejected by those who prefer power over thinking. Al-Farabi was forgotten because he refused to bow, neither to authoritarian religion nor to cold, instrumental reason. He dreamed of a politics based on virtue in an age ruled by empires. He defended the union of reason and faith when the world was choosing walls. He spoke of a shared humanity when kingdoms spoke of purity. Today, his name is still little known, but his philosophy remains like a quiet lighthouse, waiting for us to look at it, not with the eyes of the past, but with the courage to reimagine the future. If you've made it this far, it's because philosophy is also alive inside you. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive into the history of thinkers who were silenced, forgotten, but never truly defeated. If this content touched you, challenged you, or made you think in a different way, hit the like button. It really helps the video reach more people. Share it with someone you know who loves a good question. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episode of this journey through critical thinking. Comment down below, which one of these philosophers impacted you the most? Or which other forgotten thinker do you think deserves to be remembered here? Stay with us. Here, the thinking never stops. See you in the next video.